However, I hope this might be the second best thing. Certainly with COVID restrictions still in force in the St Mary's Hospital site and many other NHS facilities, this is as much as we can hope for. And that's an important reminder. The museum is where Fleming's lab was, and it was an integral part of our hospital. Anyway, I thought I would start off by giving you a tantalising view of what you might be missing. Now, this is a short video that was made for general popular use last year. So, as you'll notice, everything is COVID secure. So, just to give you some idea of what you're missing. But let's go back.
I think this must be one of the most exciting and important places in the history of the last century. If you think of the number of lives saved by penicillin, I always feel when I come in that Alexander Fleming is about to come back in. He's about to pick up a petri dish he left before he went off on holiday and finds that it has become contaminated by a mould. That mould has produced something that has killed off bacteria in the dish. That was how he discovered penicillin in this very place. When you think of it, the world would be very different without penicillin. And that world-changing discovery, and it really was a world-changing one, happened here.
Well, I hope that does give you some idea of the museum. So, what happened in that space to make it so world-changing? Well, I want to start by showing you something that Alexander Fleming used to give out as gifts to people. He received awards from all over the world as the discovery of penicillin, and he wanted to give something back. And what he thought people would appreciate most would be a piece of the mould that made penicillin. Now, some of these moulds were given to all sorts of people. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, got 2. Winston Churchill, President Roosevelt got 1 each. And even Marlene Dietrich, the actress, got 1. She had a crush on Fleming, invited him to dinner. And afterwards, he put his hand in his pocket and pulled out 1 of these. Now, I want to ask you, how much do you think these are actually worth? They went to auction. Well, in person, we could have conducted a mock auction, but I'll cut that short and say that one of them went for £25,000. That was about 20 years ago. So I think it shows the importance anything to do with penicillin has. One of the moulds Fleming gave to Edgar Lawley. He was chairman of the Board of Governors at St Mary's. Lawley was a jeweller, and he had it mounted in gold, just like a medieval saint's reliquary. So if you like, this is a sacred relic to some people. But I want to ask you to think about something else. How much do you think a vial of penicillin on its own would be worth? Now, some people would come up with a monetary value, but I'd argue that if you think of the impact penicillin has had, you just cannot put a value on it. You cannot put a monetary value on the number of lives saved or the quality of life improved. That's where the importance of penicillin lies. And the discovery all began here back in the summer of 1928 at St Mary's Hospital, Paddington. Fleming's laboratory is in the turret on the right-hand side of the picture. It's the middle window, the one with the pediment. I'm sure when he was allocated that space, they knew just how important it would be, or perhaps not. And when you think about it, it was only at St Mary's that penicillin would have ever been discovered. Years later, Fleming was being shown around state-of-the-art lab in the United States. And a journalist asked him what he thought of it. Oh, well, he said, it's all very nice, but of course, I could never have discovered penicillin here. It's far too clean. So perhaps it's only in old buildings where there's some decay that penicillin could ever have been discovered. If there's no possibility of contamination, there would be no mold, no penicillin. So it's also a case that you don't need the best of facilities with a lab to do something wonderful. This, as you've already seen, is Fleming's lab. It's musty, it's dusty, old-fashioned, low-tech, and yet he said it was the sort of place he liked to work in. He didn't claim it was the best lab he'd worked in. That was one he worked in during the First World War at the Casino Boulogne, which had been turned into a military hospital. The lab he was allocated there had no equipment, no gas, no running water. Fleming had to improvise everything, so did his colleagues. And that was the sort of lab he liked. He was a man with a flair for improvisation. And if he'd made things himself, they could be exactly how he wanted them. This is the man, behold the man, Alexander Fleming, who on the 1st of September 1928 became Professor of Bacteriology at St Mary's Hospital, Paddington. He was 47, so in mid-career. And on Monday, the 3rd of September, he entered his lab, coming back from work, from a holiday. He'd been away for about 6 weeks. Came back to his lab, and in the course of the day, he checked some culture plates he'd been working on before he went on holiday. He'd prepared some culture plates of staphylococci just in order to make some observations for a chapter he'd been asked to write for a medical research council textbook on bacteriology. He'd been allocated the chapter on staphylococci. So he prepared some culture plates, finished the work, went off on holiday, and left the plates on the lab bench. Not because he was lazy or careless, far from it. That was what he always did. He would leave his culture plates for a couple of weeks after he'd finished, and then check them for one last time, just in case anything interesting, anything unusual might have happened. Very much it was the attitude of the 19th century naturalist. Someone interested in unusual phenomena. It was an approach that was about to pay off. As he was examining his culture plates, something on one of them caught his attention. That's funny. That's funny, he said. Momentous words for momentous occasion. Fleming was a master of understatement. This is a photograph of a culture plate he took at the time. And what is perhaps most noticeable at the top is that the culture plate has become contaminated by a fungus. Fleming wasn't interested in that fungus. Contamination like that happened all the time. What interested Fleming was not what was there, but what was not there. Close to the mould, there's a clear zone of inhibition. The fungus had produced something that stopped the growth of the bacteria. That's something Fleming at first called mould juice. Well, it's a very descriptive name, but when he needed to publish, he decided to give it a more scientific name. He decided to call it penicillin, the product of the fungus Penicillium notatum. Well, now Penicillium notatum is seen as a subspecies of Penicillium chrysogenum, and as more is known about its genetic makeup, could be reclassified yet again. Well, people have accused Fleming of just being lucky. He just happened to be in the right place at the right time. But you can have all the good fortune in the world. If you yourselves are not intellectually prepared to take advantage of that good fortune, you might as well forget it. Now, technically, this culture plate shouldn't look like that. If it had been incubated, the fungus would have been killed by the temperature needed to incubate the staphylococci. So, although he doesn't say so, Fleming must have left his plates at ambient room temperature. The fungus would need a lower temperature in order to grow and be in a position to inhibit the bacteria, which would grow at normal body temperature. Now, why did Fleming leave the plates on the lab bench? Well, that summer, he'd read a paper by another bacteriologist, Joseph Biggar of Trinity College Dublin, which suggested that you could get some interesting staphylococcal variations if you incubated at room temperature. And also that you could assess the virulence of the bacteria by its pigmentation. We'll see the significance of that for Fleming in a moment. But think about it. This happened when Fleming went on holiday at the end of July and early August 1928. it should be too warm for the fungus to develop. However, Met Office records for 1928 show an unseasonally cold spell just the end of July and beginning of August, followed by normal ambient temperatures. So, is that luck or what? But anyway, the important thing is Fleming was prepared to take advantage of his observation. He had an imaginative approach to science. If you like, he thought outside the box. Now, one of his hobbies was art. He's a member of the Chelsea Arts Club. But he didn't bother with oils or watercolours, too easy. Fleming produced what he called germ paintings. Effectively, he would draw a sketch onto absorbent paper, coat it with a growth medium, culture medium, and then, using his knowledge of bacteria, he would colour it in by sowing different bacteria, and he would know just how to get the right pigmentation. You can see some examples here. One of them is of a guardsman. Fleming had that on display, he was so proud of it, when the then King and Queen came to open some new buildings at St Mary's. No less an art critic than Queen Mary loudly commented to Fleming that she didn't see the point of them. She was noted for her tact. But what it tells us about Fleming is his imaginative approach, his originality of thought, but also gives an explanation of why he was so interested in growing the staphylococci at ambient room temperature. He was interested in variations in pigmentation. So not only for the scientific chapter he'd been asked to write for the textbook, but also for his own hobby. Gives you an idea of the sort of man he was. He was also noted for his powers of observation, and these had been honed by his upbringing on a Scottish hill farm in Asia. But his scientific career really began at St Mary's Hospital Medical School in Paddington. He entered St Mary's in 1901. When he graduated in 1908, he was the top medical student in the University of London. Now, his original ambition was to be a surgeon. There were no vacancies, so he was offered a position, a temporary position, in the inoculation department labs, where he worked on bacteriology. The reason he was offered this was partly because he was such a brilliant student and they didn't want to lose him to another London hospital. But also he was a good shot. The hospital had a rifle team. The captain of it had a senior position in the labs of the inoculation department and persuaded the head of the department, Sir Almroth Wright, to give Fleming a temporary job. Well, if you'll pardon the pun, Fleming got the bug for bacteriology. And you could argue that he was to do more for bacteriology. As a bacteriologist, he was to do more for surgery than he could ever have done as a surgeon. He also himself claimed to be the only fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons never to have operated. Well, while he was working in the inoculation department, he came under the mentorship of Sir Almroth Wright. Quite a controversial figure, Almroth Wright was known to his contemporaries as Sir Almost Wright and Sir Always Young. He was a friend of the playwright George Bernard Shaw, who immortalised him in the play The Doctor's Dilemma, which raises the question of who do you treat if you have inadequate resources and too great a demand? An ethical question still valid today. And it's a play that's still worth seeing. It's not just a period piece. But Almroth Wright's great ambition was to effect a revolution in medicine. He believed that the future lay with immunology, stimulate the phagocytes, which was a catchphrase given to him by George Bernard Shaw in The Doctor's Dilemma. And his idea was that the only way to treat disease was to administer autogenous vaccines to treat the bacterial infection in a particular individual. It's an interesting idea, but it led nowhere. However, Wright remained wedded to his own ideas. When he saw they weren't working, he thought, according to logic, they should. Therefore, logic and logical systems must be fallacious. They must be faulty. So he devoted the rest of his working life to finding a better method of logic. Now, one of his main achievements was to introduce and develop an anti-typhoid vaccine that, once modified, was to be a lifesaver in the First World War. But his other great contribution was to inspire younger workers. And his inoculation department had a number of people who made great achievements. Leonard Colebrooke was to make great advances in the treatment of puerperal sepsis, and also in the use of antibiotics to treat burns, the infections arising from burns. John Freeman was to be one of the great pioneers of allergy and treatment for hay fever. But perhaps the best known of all was Alexander Fleming. Now, Fleming was a lot more open-minded than his mentor, Almroth Wright. In 1909, Almroth Wright's great friend, Paul Ehrlich, who had developed Salvarsan, the first modern effective treatment for syphilis, an alternative to the use of mercury. He sent an early sample to Wright. Wright had no time for any form of chemotherapy and handed the samples of Salvarsan to his junior, Alexander Fleming, who gained a reputation as a pox doctor. Good at making laboratory glassware and adept with his hands, he was also one of the few people who could comfortably and safely administer a drug using the then new technique of intravenous injection. Now, in his spare time, Fleming was a private in the London Scottish Regiment, a territorial volunteer unit. And as I said earlier, he was also a member of the Chelsea Arts Club. And one of his friends in the Chelsea Arts Club, Ronald Gray, produced this cartoon of Fleming as Private 606, administering Salvarsan, which was also known as Compound 606. Before hitting on an effective compound, Ehrlich had tried out 605 other arsenical compounds. Now, in the cartoon, instead of a bayonet, Fleming has a syringe, and also tucked into his stocking, in place of a dirk, is another syringe, so Private 606. I should say that some of his fellow other Yankers were patients of his. During the First World War, Fleming, working with Wright, showed that use of strong antiseptics was doing more harm than good, and his advice was to instead simply keep the wound clean, wash it out with a mild saline solution. It was sensible advice and not adopted by the British Army until the Second World War. One thing doctors and generals have in common is that neither of them likes to be told what to do. Well, as I said, Fleming was a lot more open-minded than Arnold Wright to new ideas. And in 1921, he discovered the enzyme lysozyme, which in many ways was to be a great influence on the development of penicillin, made Fleming more receptive to what he saw on his culture plate. In October 1921, Fleming had a cold. He wondered what would happen if he added some of his nasal mucus to a plate of bacteria he was working on, Micrococcus lysidipticus, or as it's now known, Micrococcus luteus, which Fleming had just discovered. Well, after a couple of weeks, he found that something in his nasal mucus was dissolving the bacteria. That something was the enzyme lysozyme. Now, I know it sounds disgusting, but it's how it happened. Fleming always said that his best work as a scientist had been done on lysozyme, and that was an honest assessment. He took its study onto a higher level than he ever did with penicillin. The problem, though, with lysozyme is it doesn't act against the most pathogenic of bacteria. So when Fleming saw what penicillin did, his first thought was, could this be another enzyme, the more potent one? Well, very soon he discovered and established that penicillin was not an enzyme, but by then he was interested in it for itself. The importance, though, is lysozyme is what made him receptive to the inhibition he saw with penicillin. Well, he set to work to investigate further. He had the help of two young research assistants, Stuart Craddock at the top and Frederick Ridley. Neither of them was a chemist, let alone a biochemist. And they found a couple of problems. They couldn't stabilize the penicillin, and they couldn't purify it. Penicillin soon lost its power to do any good. and also it was very impure. So at first it was only used topically, but even though he couldn't purify or stabilise penicillin, Fleming could see a clinical potential. He himself had used it virtually as a local antiseptic. He used it on Stuart Craddock, who had sinusitis. It had no effect. Now, not surprising when you consider that Craddock was actually suffering from tuberculosis. But he had a later success when using it as an eye wash on a student of his who wanted to take part in a shooting competition. And the conjunctivitis cleared up. But the problem remained that of production, stabilisation and purification. Until those problems could be overcome, the use of penicillin was always going to be limited. However, when he published his paper on penicillin in the British Journal of Experimental Pathology in 1929, Fleming actually said that penicillin might have a topical use, almost like a local antiseptic, but also he talks about systemic use. He talks about injection into areas infected with penicillin-sensitive microbes. So if you like, he's got the idea of penicillin as an antibiotic, even before the word antibiotic had come into use. He's got the idea, he publishes the idea, and he keeps the fungus alive and sends samples to other labs. But that was as far as he could go. And it wasn't until 1939 that there was hope of an advance. And that year, a research team at the University of Oxford began work on penicillin, led by the Professor of Pathology, Howard Florey. His team included a German Jewish refugee from the Nazis, Ernst Chain. They had just finished a research project on lysozyme, Fleming's earlier discovery, when they turned their attention to penicillin. And the reason they did was they were looking for a new research topic, a purely academic research topic. At this stage, they weren't interested in practical applications, as Chain stressed in 1971. And penicillin was one of the most promising subjects. And that was because they had just finished a research project on lysozyme. Chain had an expertise with enzymes. And what attracted them to penicillin, as it had done for Fleming, was the similarities between the action of penicillin and lysozyme. They could have saved themselves a lot of work if they'd believed Fleming when he said penicillin wasn't an enzyme. But this was what encouraged them to set to work in the development of penicillin. Here you can see Ernst Chain. It's an image which very much sums up the dedicated scientist. He looks a bit like Einstein. He was, though, very difficult to work with. He was a diva. He could have been a concert pianist, but he chose bacteriology and biochemistry. And as a biochemist, he was to make a great contribution to the development of penicillin. Another biochemist on the Oxford team was Norman Heatley. And Heatley was to develop an effective production method. Now they began work as the Second World War began. Everything was in short supply. They had to improvise on a massive scale. And Norman Heatley was as much a lover of improvisation as Fleming ever had been. Anything they could lay their hands on was pressed into service. Bathtubs, fridge coolants, milk churns, biscuit tins, and even hospital bedpans. In fact, they found that the shape of the hospital bedpan was perhaps the best for the culture of penicillin. So in 1941, when they could afford to have some special ceramic culture vessels made, the design was based on that of the bedpan. They could easily be stacked. However, I would say that the design is a combination of bedpan and biscuit tin, adapted biscuit tin. But of course, it seems much more fun to simply use the bedpan analogy. Well, using methods of back extraction, by the end of 1940, it was possible to consider clinical use of penicillin. The first patient to be treated with penicillin was Albert Alexander, a 41-year-old policeman. He was said to have scratched himself whilst gardening. Scratched himself on a rose bush. But there's also evidence that he had been injured when carrying out air precaution duties during a blitz when he'd been sent to Southampton. Anyway, the infection spread through his body. Severe septicemia. As a result of it, he lost an eye. And it was decided to try out penicillin on him, a new, as yet untested therapy. There was nothing to be lost. The man was dying. And at first he showed some signs of recovery, but there were a couple of problems. The first was the only penicillin they had was what they could make in the labs themselves. They couldn't make enough penicillin to treat one patient with a severe infection. But the second problem offered an answer to the first. Now, as you're probably all aware, penicillin is quickly excreted from the human body. So they would station someone at the foot of the man's bed to collect his urine, and then cycle with it back to the labs of the William Dunn School of Pathology at Oxford from the Radcliffe Infirmary, where they would extract any usable penicillin for the injection. And you thought that recycling was a modern concept. It's not. Howard Florey was later to say that penicillin had been discovered by Fleming at St Mary's, Paddington, in 1928. It had been developed for clinical use by himself and his team at the University of Oxford in the early 1940s, and it had been purified by passing it through the Oxford Constabulary. Remember that Albert Alexander was a policeman. Well, at first he showed some signs of recovery. Soon there was no usable penicillin left. And the man died. All from a simple scratch. Well, when they built up further stocks of penicillin, the Oxford team used it on people with less severe infections or on children who were smaller. They didn't need as much. But whilst you had penicillin that was being produced in a lab and had a clinical use, you still needed to scale production up to an industrial scale. For a time, the William Dunn School of Pathology at Oxford converted into a wartime penicillin factory, was the largest penicillin production unit in the United Kingdom. But you needed to get industry involved. Wartime Britain was not the best place for that. Pharmaceuticals took second place to munitions. So, with a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation, Florey and his colleague Norman Hickley decided to take penicillin to North America. The United States, in the summer of 1941, was still at peace, but crucially had a much larger industrial capacity than Britain. They went on a carpetbagging tour of the North American chemical and pharmaceutical industries. They met with polite interest, but that was it. What held back these big industrial firms was the fear that penicillin could easily be synthesized. Now, at this stage, penicillin was coming into use, but no one really knew what it was, or, to be honest, how it worked. It was widely thought that it would be easy to synthesize it. So, if it could be synthesized, then any production methods based on the mold would be obsolete overnight. What they didn't know in 1941 was that penicillin would be too difficult and expensive to synthesize. And it wasn't until 1941 at MIT, until 1957 at MIT, that penicillin was synthesized in a lab. But no one knew that back in 1941. It only became obvious after the chemical structure of penicillin was established by another team at Oxford, including Ernst Chain, and also the X-ray crystallographer Dorothy Hodgkin. Only then was it realised what the structure of penicillin was and that it would be too difficult to synthesise. No one knew that back in 1941. However, luckily, the United States federal government was more interested. And that year, President Roosevelt had signed an act setting up a the Office of Scientific Research and Development. Its mission was to prepare scientifically and medically for what was now seen as inevitable American involvement in the World War. One of its biggest achievements was the Manhattan Project that led to the development of the atom bomb. On a similar scale, but with a very different end in sight, was penicillin. At one time, 39 universities and industrial units were working on synthesis. But the real achievement was to come with production from the mold. Norman Heatley was sent to work at the United States Department of Agriculture Northern Regional Research Laboratory at Peoria, Illinois. There, they had 2 new fermenters and also held the United States fungal type collections. But also there was a local expertise and know-how in fermentation techniques. Now, up to this time, penicillin had been produced at Oxford using surface culture methods. It was believed it would be more productive if you could produce penicillin using submerged culture. Now, Peoria was a good place to investigate that because before Prohibition, it had been a centre of whiskey production. It had the know-how. And Norman Heatley was sent to work with this man, Andrew Moyer. Moyer was another biochemist. Brilliant, but very difficult for Heatley to work with. Moyer was anti-British and pro-Nazi at a time when such attitudes were not uncommon in the Midwest. But he and Heatley developed a method of production using submerged culture that was to become the basis of modern post-war production. As long as the Second World War lasted, most production was based on a scaled-up method of the Oxford production process. But after the war, all production was based on the methods developed by Heatley and Moyer at Peoria. Well, penicillin was never patented in the United Kingdom. Fleming couldn't have patented a substance occurring in nature under the laws of the time. How different it all is now. And Florey refused to consider patenting the production methods pioneered at Oxford because he thought it would be unethical for a doctor to be involved in commerce. Florey, very much as an Australian, felt himself to be an outsider. So he didn't want to upset the establishment. In the United States, though, work in a federal lab, patents were taken out by the federal government for United States rights. But the lab worker could take out world rights. And Andrew Moyer did that behind the back of his British colleague, Norman Heatley. Now, as the war came to an end, there was concern that Moyer would exercise his world rights in the production methods. But pressure was put on him not to do so. And as a federal government employee, if he wanted to keep his job, then had to go with what the government wanted. As I said, a brilliant biochemist, but a very difficult man. Years ago, I was the Andrew Moyer lecturer at Peoria, talking on the subject of the development of penicillin. And I had to be careful, or thought I did, in what I said about the man. After all, it wasn't a pointless lecture. I needn't have worried. Afterwards, an elderly lady came up and said, "You were very right about Andrew Moyer." She'd worked with him in the late 1940s. She said he was a right son of a bitch. Well, we still had to get industry involved if you wanted to scale up production. And the Office of Scientific Research and Development convened 2 meetings of the American pharmaceutical and chemical industries in October and November 1941. They urged the desirability of a concentrated programme of research on penicillin, involving the pooling of information and results. They met with polite interest, nothing more. A 3rd meeting was convened on the 17th of December 1941. Now they couldn't wait to get ahead with penicillin. What made the difference? This was 10 days after Pearl Harbor. The United States was now at war. But don't think it was only wartime patriotism that motivated these hard-headed industrialists. There were sound practical motives for getting involved in penicillin production. The United States military wanted penicillin. They didn't care if it was synthetic or if it came from a mold. They wanted the benefits, the military benefits, and getting your men back into action much more quickly after wounds or sickness. So, military pressure in turn meant that the Wartime Production Board gave priority to penicillin, and with it, access to raw materials and labour. Later in the war, there was an 85% tax on industrial profit. And this was a big incentive to reinvestment in research and development, rather than to pay such a high level of taxation, even if it was to win the war. Now, all those involved in the penicillin production projects were encouraged to share information and results, almost unknown amongst industrial rivals. But in the United States, this was technically against the law. It was against the antitrust legislation. So for about 12 months, penicillin ignored the law. The antitrust legislation was just ignored, and then penicillin was exempted from it. So the sharing of information was encouraged. Now, whilst most wartime production was based on the Oxford's surface culture methods, in 1943, Pfizer built the first purpose-built penicillin plant, Brooklyn. Penicillin was what brought Pfizer into the pharmaceutical industry. Up to the 1940s, it had been a manufacturer of citric acid for the soft drinks industry. But it had the technical know-how because of that that was needed in penicillin production. And in 1943, Pfizer decided to build a plant using the submerged culture methods developed at Peoria. They wanted a new plant so it would be separate from their main income earner, citric acid. They didn't want any possibility of contamination. Workmen were urged that the faster this building is completed, the quicker our wounded men get penicillin. And it was urged as a way of helping to win the war in a race against death on the battlefield. Give this job everything you've got. The men were exhorted, both by posters and by notes in their pay slips. But there were a lot of people who just wanted to get into penicillin production. And it was noted that there were some amateurs who were doing it as much for fun as from patriotic or pecuniary motives. One New York businessman was producing penicillin in whiskey bottles in a cobweb-filled basement. In Britain, the Sunday newspapers told you how to make penicillin over the kitchen sink. Luckily, none of that ever got into the supply chain. But as production went up at a massive rate, the unit costs of penicillin came down. And very much, this was all thanks to the sharing of information amongst industrial firms. However, as the war came closer to its end, particular companies decided to hold back information that would give them a commercial advantage after the war. So, the coordinator of the penicillin program in the United States, Albert Elder, was to say that progress could have been much more rapid with the free interchange of material. But penicillin came into its own. It was first used for military purposes after the invasion of Sicily and in the North African campaigns of 1943. At first, it was to be kept back for wounded soldiers, but it was found that it was effective against syphilis. There was then the question, who do you give penicillin to? Do you give it to war heroes who were wounded? Or do you give it to men with what was seen as a self-inflicted wound? And you can just imagine the outcry back at home. It was known that penicillin had been given to men with VD, even though treatment with penicillin was, as Howard Florey described it, like turning off a bath tap. You could get men back into action much more quickly than if they had wounds, much more quickly in more ways than one. Anyway, it was referred up to Churchill, who wrote on the memo in his characteristic green ink, "This must be used to the best military advantage." Well, what did it mean? It was interpreted as giving it to VD suckers. Get them back into action as quickly as possible. It was only with the Normandy landings of June 1944 that penicillin was available for widespread use in the battlefields for the liberation of Europe. But at first it was mainly for military use. And whilst it was in short supply for civilian use, there was something of a penicillin mania. There was talk of such wonders to come as penicillin toothpaste and penicillin lipstick for that hygienic kiss. Luckily, it never came about. Meanwhile, everybody wanted penicillin. Eleanor Roosevelt appealed for penicillin to save the life of the dying sweetheart of a serving GI, in a case where penicillin would, and indeed did, have no effect. No one could deny Mrs. Roosevelt what she wanted, except perhaps the president or his mistress, and not even then. But with the end of the war looming, penicillin did become more widely available. It was available for civilian use in the United States from March 1945, and in Britain from June 1946. Well, you could argue that if it hadn't been for the Second World War, it would have taken longer for penicillin to be developed than it would have done otherwise. And I think that is a fair judgment. Penicillin would have been developed, but just as with the development of COVID vaccines, an emergency focused minds and meant that great effort was coming into finding some answer, some solution as quickly as possible. With penicillin, the Second World War meant that some of the equipment needed wasn't available. Also, some of the ingredients for the production of penicillin were in short supply. For example, lactose was needed for penicillin production, which was also needed for baby feed. And there was an equally valid argument that saving the life of the younger generation was one of the war aims. Lactose was also needed for the production of milk stout, invaluable, of course, for morale in wartime. It was a dilemma that was never answered. But generally speaking, you can say that penicillin was given an impetus by the war. Well, Alexander Fleming, Ernst Chain and Howard Florey were to share the 1945 Nobel Prize for Medicine. Fleming for the discovery of penicillin, Florey and Chain for its development. It seems a fair division of the honours, and it is, insofar as it goes. The thing is, there were so many other people behind the development of penicillin. It wasn't just one man, it wasn't just one team. It was a great international, multinational effort. Well, I'm sure that in many ways, knowing the impact penicillin had was of greater value than the Nobel Prize. But even in the hour of glory, the problems to come were there. In his Nobel speech, Fleming mentions the dangers of antibiotic resistance. As an experienced bacteriologist, he knew what to expect. He'd seen it with lysozyme, and also He'd warned in scientific papers of antibiotic resistance as early as 1943. So I think we need to remember the problems as well as the achievements. And penicillin certainly ushered in the antibiotic age. So thank you for your attention this afternoon.